My own flesh and blood looked me straight in the eye and said, "Dad, you're invisible." He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. He said it the way someone comments on the weather, with a cold calmness that burned deeper than any insult screamed in anger. In that instant, the world seemed to stop. The clinking of glasses on the table disappeared. The laughter in the background faded. Even the ticking of the clock on the wall felt like it was mocking me. I didn't know whether to laugh, nervously, fire back, or just stand up and walk out. Instead, I froze. The marble floor seemed to slide under my feet. The air was too heavy to breathe. Jessica, my daughter, adjusted her napkin as if she hadn't just erased me in front of everyone. Brian, my son-in-law, simply raised his wine glass with that cynical smile, the same one that had always said I didn't deserve a seat at the table. And me? I stayed perfectly still. My granddaughter, too young to understand, stared at me with confusion, as if she were trying to figure out why her grandpa, the one who always had stories to tell, suddenly turned into nothing. It hurt more because this wasn't the first time. It was just the first time she said it out loud. My heart pounded deep in my chest, slow, heavy. My blood was hot, but my hands were ice cold. I touched the edge of my chair, trying to hide the tremor in my fingers. The guests tried to mask their discomfort. A woman in a blue dress looked away. A gray-haired man coughed and fiddled with his cufflinks. No one defended me, not one person. The silence was a courtroom, and the verdict had already been handed down. In that chandelier-lit dining room, I was a ghost. But what no one knew was that even a ghost can leave a mark. That night, I stayed quiet, not out of cowardice, but because I'd learned something. Sometimes silence is stronger than any comeback. Silence holds weight. Silence prepares. And deep inside me, something shifted. It was like an ember that had been forgotten suddenly caught its first breath of fresh air in years. It wasn't vengeance yet. It was something deeper, the certainty that I wouldn't be buried alive. I closed my eyes for a second. When I opened them, I locked eyes with Jessica. She looked away quickly, as if afraid of what she might see there. And there was something, a silent promise, invisible to everyone else in that room, but one she would soon feel on her skin. I took a deep breath. The wine in my glass tasted bitter. I set it down slowly, firmly, letting the sound of glass against wood echo. Small, but enough to remind everyone that I was still there. No one spoke. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. They were waiting for me to explode, but I refused to give them that satisfaction. I smiled, just smiled, and inside I thought, you'll learn that even the invisible can shine. And when that day comes, ignoring me won't be an option. Before I go further, let me ask you for something. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, because every comment here is more than a number. It's a collective voice saying that inside a family, respect is not a favor, it's a duty. And hit subscribe too, because each new subscription proves stories like mine aren't unique, that there are thousands of people who have been called invisible, but who one day stood tall. What Jessica didn't know was that destiny was already setting the stage, that the world outside still had space to hear my voice. And soon, when no one expected it, my face wouldn't be hidden in the corner of some fancy dinner. It would be on the front page of a newspaper. Chicago, Fall 2021. The cold wind off Lake Michigan cut through the streets like an invisible blade. The trees were nearly bare, and dry leaves piled in the corners of sidewalks, swirling whenever a car passed. As I drove my old Ford F-150, the windows rattled faintly. The engine had that deep growl of an old machine, but steady, like a reflection of myself, worn down by time, but still standing strong. I was Thomas Reed, 58, a carpenter, not the kind with manuals and mass production. I was the kind of man who learned to tame wood as a teenager, watching my father sweat in the workshop. The smell of sawdust was the smell of my life, the rough surface of raw planks turning into something smooth, polished, almost eternal. It made me feel like I wasn't just building furniture, but memories. My shop was a modest warehouse in Bridgeport. Nothing fancy. Exposed brick walls, old tools hanging on hooks, a workbench scarred with hammer dents and saw cuts. But every mark told a story. That's where I spent most of my days. But whenever I crossed the city to visit my daughter, the contrast hit like a punch. Jessica, 27, a PR executive, worked at one of the biggest event agencies in Chicago. Her world revolved around cocktail parties, fashion shows, galas with politicians and CEOs. She lived in Lakeview, in one of those tall buildings with glass lobbies and marble imported from Europe. It was impossible not to notice the gap between her life and mine. I always showed up in jeans, a plaid flannel shirt, boots still dusted with sawdust. She, on the other hand, was flawless. Sleek dresses, high heels, expensive perfumes that lingered in the air. Jessica was the kind of person who knew how to pose for a photo, even when she pretended not to. And then there was Brian, My son-in-law, early 30s, tech executive, Italian, shirts, Swiss watches, that trained smile of a man who's closed too many deals. His handshake was always quick, cold, with eyes already wandering elsewhere. To him, I was just the carpenter father-in-law, some museum piece the family tolerated out of politeness. At family gatherings, I felt like an extra in my own life's movie. Conversations revolved around international trips, investments, business expansions. Whenever I tried to share a story from the workshop, I noticed the discreet glances at phones, the polite smiles, the subtle cues that they were just waiting for me to stop talking. The only one who still made me feel seen was my granddaughter, Maria. Small, full of life. The way she ran through that luxury apartment like it was just a playground gave me relief. At least with her, I wasn't invisible. Not yet. She'd hug me tight, laugh when I did silly voices, or listen wide-eyed to stories of when her mother was her age. But even that bond, I felt, was being chipped away. Jessica would cut my stories short, saying they weren't appropriate for a child. Brian always made sure Maria had electronic toys, pulling her away from the wooden cars I carved with so much care. It was as if my presence was tolerated, but never celebrated. Like I was an old portrait on the wall, not thrown away, but never really noticed either. And the setting only made that distance clearer. When I arrived at Jessica's building, the doorman would look at me with a mix of respect and surprise, as if wondering, what's a man like him doing here? Inside the mirrored elevator, I saw my reflection, a man with deep wrinkles, gray hair, worn clothes, holding a simply wrapped gift box. Next to me, other residents stepped in carrying Gucci and Louis Vuitton bags, shopping sacks from high-end boutiques. I never cared about that. I never needed luxury. But I began to realize that for my daughter, the difference wasn't just about appearances. For her, it was a dividing line. And every time I walked through that door, every time I sat at that table surrounded by well-dressed people, I could feel Jessica looking at me the way someone looks at something outdated. I was her father. But to her, I was no longer a role model. I had become a quiet weight, someone expected to sit in the corner and smile silently. That distance didn't appear overnight. It grew slowly, first in Brian's contemptuous glances, then in Jessica's subtle corrections. Dad, don't say that. Dad, you don't have to tell that story. And then in the invitations that started to disappear. One party, then another, until the only way I knew about my daughter's milestones was through social media photos, not because she had told me. Still, I insisted on being present, because I believed that somehow a father's love could break through any wall. But I didn't know that wall was about to become solid concrete, and for the first time, my daughter would carve into it in cold, clear letters. Dad, you're invisible. When I close my eyes, I can still smell fresh-cut wood, mixed with the dust that floated in the air. My entire life was shaped in that workshop. I didn't become a carpenter because I had no options. I chose it, because since boyhood I discovered something magical about turning the raw into the beautiful, the imperfect into something useful. My father, George Reed, was the kind of man who spoke little, but whose every piece of furniture carried a silent lesson. From him, I learned that wood has personality, that an old oak demands respect, that pine requires patience, and that a table is never just a table. It's where a family gathers, where decisions are made, where life happens. At 18, I inherited not just the shop, but the responsibility of keeping a tradition alive. While my friends dreamed of downtown Chicago office jobs, I spent nights in the shop testing new cuts, new joints, chasing perfection in every detail, and I succeeded. Over time, my furniture made its way into the homes of old Chicago families. Big houses in Lincoln Park and the Gold Coast had cabinets, tables, and shelves crafted by me. Sometimes, I'd pass one of those mansions and know, silently, that inside stood a piece of my work. But the strange thing was this. While strangers valued my craft, inside my own home it seemed to mean nothing. Jessica grew up surrounded by the sound of hammers, the smell of varnish, the stories I told while sanding a chair. As a child, she loved sitting in the corner of the shop, playing with scraps of wood as if they were dolls. I smiled then, believing that would be our eternal bond. I remember clearly when she turned 18. I worked quietly for weeks, preparing a special gift, a solid wood table, made from the same tree that had stood in the backyard of the house where she grew up. Every detail mattered. The legs had delicate curves. The top gleamed under the light. It was my way of saying, daughter, even if you leave, here your roots will remain. When I gave it to her, her eyes lit up for a few seconds, but then they dimmed when Brian, her boyfriend at the time, casually remarked, "Nice, but it takes up too much space." Maybe one day we'll replace it with something more modern. Jessica didn't answer. She just smiled at him. And in that moment, I knew my table had already lost its place. Later, I found out it was stored away in a warehouse. That hurt, not because of the table itself, but because of what it represented. That table was more than wood and varnish. It was a father's declaration of love. It was emotional inheritance. Even so, I carried on. I built furniture for local universities, for churches, even for a small art gallery that invited me to exhibit a shelf made without nails, held together only by perfect joints. Critics applauded it, but in my own family, my name was nothing but an awkward detail. Jessica rarely mentioned me at the events she organized. When someone asked about her family, she answered quickly, deflecting. My dad has his own business. Just something simple. Simple. That word always cut like a blade. It didn't matter that I had provided for our household alone for decades. It didn't matter that every dollar of her college tuition had come from the sound of my hammer and my saw. To her, I was simple, invisible, but the world outside saw me differently. Once, an architect couple told me, "Your work has soul." That's rare these days. And a design, Professor, after visiting my workshop, said, "Mr. Reed, you're more of an artist than you realize." Those words fueled me. They reminded me my worth was real. Yet the more recognition came from outside, the farther Jessica seemed to drift. It was as if the success I carved in my world of woodwork had no space in the glass showcase where she wanted to live, and that ate at me. Because deep down, every father longs to be recognized, not by strangers, but by his own children. Each time I saw one of my tables in a luxurious dining room, I remembered my daughter laughing in front of friends, pretending my work didn't exist. Each time a local architecture magazine praised my designs, I remembered the table I made for Jessica rotting in some storage unit. I was used to carrying the weight of silence, but nothing could prepare me for the day when my own daughter, without hesitation, would say in front of everyone, "My father is invisible." That phrase wasn't born that night. It was the cruel summary of a lifetime of being underestimated. And in that moment, I realized my story was far from over. It was at my granddaughter Maria's birthday that the wound finally tore open in front of everyone. That night looked at first glance like just another one of Jessica and Brian's glamorous gatherings in their Lakeview apartment. Crystal chandeliers cast golden reflections across white walls. A hired pianist played softly in the corner, while waiters floated around with champagne. Flutes balanced on silver trays. I had arrived early. I always did. In my hands, I carried a plain box, wrapped in craft paper with a red ribbon I had tied myself. Inside was a gift I had worked on for weeks, a wooden rocking horse. I crafted every detail by hand, sanded it smooth as a child's skin, painted it with non-toxic paint, and carved the name Maria discreetly along the side. I walked into the room smiling, though I could already feel the sideways glances. I knew I didn't belong there. My worn boots stood out against the polished shoes of the executives. My flannel shirt clashed with the silk dresses and Italian suits, but none of that mattered, because I was there for my granddaughter. Maria ran toward me, hugged my legs, and shouted, "Grandpa!" For a few seconds, everything made sense. That alone was enough. But soon, Brian walked over, placing a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Careful with her dress, Dad," he muttered under his breath, as if I were some kind of hazard. I took a deep breath. I ignored it. I handed Maria her gift. She opened it. Her eyes lit up and she exclaimed, "It's beautiful!" But before she could climb onto the rocking horse, Jessica cut in with a cold smile. "Later, sweetie. Right now we've got some modern toys to show." She pointed to a huge box wrapped in gold ribbon, hiding a flashy children's tablet loaded with colorful apps. The guests applauded, laughed, snapped photos. My gift was pushed discreetly into a corner, treated like some outdated relic. I stood there, watching. My face burned, as if a spotlight of humiliation was shining on me. No one noticed, no one cared, and then came the line. In the middle of casual conversation, someone asked Jessica, "Is that your father?" She laughed, tucked her hair behind her ear, and answered loud enough for everyone to hear, "My dad? Oh, he's invisible at these kinds of events. Always has been." The whole room froze. The pianist missed a note. A few guests exchanged quick, uneasy glances. But soon, the laughter returned, smothering the heavy silence. I didn't laugh. My throat locked up. My heart pounded in my neck. My hands were sweating. I looked at my daughter, as if searching for some trace of the little girl who once ran barefoot through my workshop, begging to play with scraps of wood. But that girl was long gone. In her place stood an elegant woman with a calculated smile who discarded me as easily as she swapped her shoes. I tried to say something, but no words came. I just set my glass down on the table. The sharp clink of glass echoed through the room. A few people turned, waiting for me to react, but I didn't give them the show they wanted. I stayed silent. Maria looked at me, confused, as if she sensed something was wrong, but couldn't quite grasp what. Her innocent eyes cut through me, asking for an answer I couldn't give. And in that silence, the humiliation only grew heavier, because there is nothing crueler than being erased in front of your own family, not with shouting, not with violent insults, but with a short, cold, inescapable sentence. That night, I felt something die inside me, but at the same time, something else was born. Because if my daughter truly believed I was invisible, I promised myself she would one day find out otherwise, not with fights, not with shouting, but with proof. And that was the moment the story shifted. After that night, nothing was ever the same. I went home with the bitter taste still in my mouth, like I had swallowed something impossible to digest. Jessica's words kept echoing. My dad is invisible, always has been. The silence of my workshop in the early hours mocked me. I sat at the bench, ran my hand over wood still damp with varnish, and realized the irony. Everything I touched in that place gained shape, life, and purpose. But inside my own family, I was nothing more than a shadow without a voice. And the worst part wasn't that dinner. The worst part came after. It wasn't a punch. It wasn't an open betrayal. It was a series of small cuts, one after another, until the skin of the soul was left raw. The following month, Jessica organized a major event, a gallery opening downtown, attended by politicians and business leaders. I saw the photos on social media, her smiling, posing with officials, raising flutes of French champagne. I wasn't there. I hadn't been invited. When I asked her over the phone, she replied almost automatically, "Dad, you wouldn't feel comfortable. These events are very formal, you know," as if I were a stranger who didn't know how to hold a fork. Then came Christmas. I had prepared a special box for Maria, colored wooden blocks, each piece hand-carved, sanded, and coated in safe, non-toxic varnish. I imagined her eyes lighting up as she built castles, bridges, houses, the same way I did as a boy. I arrived early. The lights twinkled. The smell of roast turkey filled the apartment. I handed Maria the gift, excited. She hugged it and laughed. But Brian, without even really looking, said, "Interesting, but she's already got a new Lego set, much more modern." Jessica smiled faintly, and there my blocks lay, forgotten under the tree, while everyone crowded around to watch Maria unwrap giant imported toys. I sat on the couch, forcing a smile, but inside it felt like every laugh was a hammer strike against everything I stood for. Even in the smallest gestures, I noticed it. Once, when I arrived for dinner, I reached out my hand to Brian. He shook it quickly, already looking down at his phone, as if greeting his father-in-law was just a needless formality. Another time, as I was telling a story from the workshop, Jessica cut me off mid-sentence to change the subject. "Dad, you can tell that later. Right now, we're talking about something else." I went quiet. I always did. But every time I swallowed a response, I felt another piece of myself vanish. What hurt most, though, was seeing Maria slowly being pulled away from me. When I took her to the workshop, she was enchanted. She'd run between the scraps of wood, laugh at the dust clinging to her clothes, stare wide-eyed as a piece came to life under my hands. But little by little, Jessica began coming up with excuses. "Not today, Dad. She has ballet class. She can't. She's busy with English lessons. Maybe another day." And that another day never came. I knew what was happening. It was like they were trying to rewrite Maria's story, erasing her craftsman grandfather, replacing him with something more acceptable. These small situations piled up like drops of water on stone. Alone, they seemed insignificant, but together they carved cracks. I wasn't just invisible anymore. I was disposable. And every time it happened, my anger grew quietly. Not a blind rage that explodes in yelling, but a dense, cold anger that builds in your veins until it turns into fuel. I started observing more, remembering every word, every look, storing it away. I didn't react, not yet. But inside, I was already building. And this time, it wasn't furniture. It was something much bigger. I'll never forget one night in particular. We were all in the living room. Brian was talking about a planned trip to Europe. I mentioned that I dreamed of visiting Italy someday, to see the old master carpenters. Jessica chuckled softly and said, "Dad, you don't even like leaving Chicago. Italy would be too much for you. too much for me. Those words echoed, sharp as blades. That was when I realized it wasn't just about lifestyle differences. To her, I truly was someone less. Someone who didn't even have the right to dream big. And in that moment, something inside me fully awoke. If before I had still been searching for acceptance, from that night on I began searching for something else. Proof. Proof that I was not invisible. Proof that my life carried weight, value, and impact. Proof that sooner or later everyone would have to see me for who I really was. And in that silence, heavy with pain, I began, for the first time, to plan my answer. Not in words, but in actions. From that moment on, I stopped waiting for recognition. The silence that once swallowed me became my ally. And while Jessica and Brian treated me like an inconvenient accessory at family gatherings, I worked quietly, storing away every detail, every cutting remark, every laugh that erased me from the room. It was during that time that I received an unexpected phone call. On the other end of the line, a woman's voice, firm yet warm. "Mr. Reed, this is Margaret Collins from the National Association of Craftsmen. We saw some of your pieces at a local fair, and we'd like to invite you to exhibit at this year's convention in New York." For a second, I thought it was a prank. New York, a national convention, journalists, renowned architects, collectors, me, the invisible man, suddenly being called to a stage I had never even dreamed of. Reaching, I swallowed hard. My voice shook as I asked, "Is this real? More than real. Your work has a rare purity. The world needs to see it." I hung up the phone and stood frozen in the middle of my shop, my heart pounding like a drum. Tools were scattered everywhere. The smell of varnish filled the air. And there I was, alone in that small space, realizing I had just been handed the chance that could change my life. I told no one, not Jessica, certainly not Brian, and not because I didn't want to share good news, but because, for the first time, I realized that keeping it quiet was the best way to protect myself. They wouldn't believe me. They'd laugh. They'd say it was nothing, that it would lead nowhere. So I stayed silent. I spent long nights in the shop, choosing the finest woods, shaping each piece with the patience of a man who wasn't just making furniture, but preparing a silent weapon. Each cut was a reminder. Each perfect joint was a reply. Each stroke of polish on the varnish was a scream I saved for the right moment. Meanwhile, at family dinners, the humiliations continued. Jessica looked at me with disdain. Brian tossed out sarcastic remarks. Their friends shook my hand with that condescending pity reserved for an outdated grandfather. I only smiled, and inside I thought, go ahead, keep going. Soon enough, you'll see. One night, we were at a fancy dinner. Jessica was glowing, talking excitedly about a big contract she had just closed with a major company. I sat quietly, listening, until someone turned to me and asked, "And you, Mr. Reed, what have you been working on lately?" Jessica laughed before I could even open my mouth. "My father? Oh, he's still doing his little wood projects." Everyone chuckled, as if it were some harmless joke. I didn't fight back. I just looked at her steadily and said quietly, "Sometimes the simple things are the ones that surprise the most." She raised her eyebrows, caught off guard by my tone. But she didn't ask anything else. I smiled faintly. As the days went by, I felt like an actor rehearsing backstage, waiting for the curtain to rise. I knew rushing would be pointless. I knew I had to wait for the right moment, and I had already decided my turning point would not happen in secret. It would not be quiet. It would be public, undeniable, big enough that even those pretending not to see would be forced to look. And every time Brian adjusted his tie and talked about million-dollar deals, every time Jessica organized another glittering party, I remembered the table I had made for her, forgotten in storage, and I promised myself, one day that table will shine, and when it does, no one will be able to deny who I am. On the eve of the New York convention, I was invited to yet another dinner at their home. The table was packed with high society guests. Jessica, radiant, introduced Brian as the man who transformed her life. I stayed quiet, sipping wine far too bitter for my simple palate. Then, at one point, a guest asked me in a mocking tone, "And you, Mr. Reed, still keeping to your same old routine?" I looked around the table, took a deep breath, and answered only, "Tomorrow, you'll find out who's really invisible." The room went silent for a few seconds. Jessica forced a nervous laugh, trying to smooth things over, but I knew the seed of doubt had been planted. That was the last time I sat at that table as an invisible man. My stage was already set, and the world was about to hear me, because even silence, when loaded with purpose, can turn into noise, and my noise soon would echo louder than anyone imagined. Before I continue this story, I want to ask you something. Has anyone ever tried to erase you, to make you feel like your presence had no value? Have you ever been made to feel like your voice didn't matter? Share it in the comments. Your story deserves to be heard. And don't forget to subscribe, because every subscription here proves that dignity is never begged for. Dignity is earned. That night in Chicago was bitterly cold, but inside Jessica and Brian's apartment the air was stifling, not because of the heat, but from the mix of expensive perfumes, rehearsed laughter, and champagne glasses clinking in mechanical rhythm. I sat at the far end of the dinner table. The white tablecloth looked more like a stage, where imported porcelain plates reflected the glow of crystal chandeliers. Around me sat executives, lawyers, wives, in discreet jewelry, all with eyes trained on appearances. Jessica sat in the center, as always, red dress, flawless hair, a smile polished for the cameras. She spoke with excitement about the new campaign she had organized for a multinational company. Every word of hers drew nods of admiration. Brian, beside her, finished her sentences with the smug assurance of a man too used to being admired. He made sure to remind everyone of his position, his travels, his million-dollar contracts. I observed in silence, a background figure at a banquet that should have been about my own family. Until one guest, a man with a trimmed beard and a gleaming watch, noticed me. "And you, Mr. Reed, what have you been working on lately?" The question wasn't born of genuine interest. It was the kind asked out of politeness, just to fill the space between one glass and the next. Before I could respond, Jessica laughed and said, "My father. Oh, he's still doing those simple wood things. Nothing new." The words dropped on the table like a cold knife. There were quiet chuckles. Brian raised his glass, confirming the joke with a satisfied look. I took a deep breath. Leaning back in my chair, I ran my fingers along the rim of the wine glass in front of me and glanced around the table. Everyone was waiting for me to smile, to nod, to let it slide one more time, but not this time. I set the glass down slowly, letting the sharp sound echo across the table. That small clink drew every eye to me. Then, without raising my voice, I said, "Sometimes the simplest things are the ones that endure. Tomorrow, you'll see who's really invisible." The silence was immediate. Some guests exchanged startled looks. Others swallowed hard. Jessica's eyes widened for a second before she tried to laugh it off. "Dad, that's nonsense. Always with those mysterious phrases." But her voice shook. She knew something was different in me that night. I was no longer the man who accepted being erased. Brian furrowed his brow, uncomfortable. "What exactly do you mean by that?" I only smiled. I didn't answer. I picked up my napkin, dabbed the corners of my mouth, and kept my gaze locked on his. For the first time, I didn't look away, and he noticed. The dinner dragged on with forced conversations, but the tension hung in the air. The pianist hit 2 wrong notes in a row. The lady in the blue dress to my left fidgeted with her earrings non-stop, as if trying to ease her nerves. Jessica tried to regain control, talking loudly about contracts and travel plans. But every word seemed weaker, like my silence was seeping into every sentence. I stayed quiet, but inside, I knew this was the final rehearsal. The curtain was about to rise. When the dinner ended, I stood before anyone else. My chair scraped against the floor, echoing across the room. I walked slowly to the door, feeling all the eyes on my back. Before leaving, I turned just slightly and said, "You'll understand tomorrow," and I left. That night at home, I sat on the porch with a steaming cup of coffee. The icy wind hit my face, but I didn't feel cold. My heart was pounding, strong, steady. For the first time, there was no doubt in me. I was ready. The confrontation hadn't been loud. No shouting, no scene. It was silent, controlled, but it was public. Everyone at that table had felt it. Everyone knew something was coming. And in that Chicago night, staring up at the stars, I realized my time of invisibility was over. Tomorrow was on its way. The next day dawned gray over Chicago. Heavy clouds covered the sky, as if even the weather knew something important was about to happen. I woke up early, unable to eat. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the tension building inside me. I put on my best suit. It wasn't new, but it was pressed, neat. I tied my tie slowly and looked in the mirror. For a moment, I hardly recognized myself. Behind the wrinkles was a man who had spent a lifetime ignored, but now carried a different fire in his eyes. I picked up the case holding the pieces I had chosen for the convention. Each item was more than wood. Each one was a piece of my life. Sleepless nights, sweat, calluses, unspoken tears. Proof that nothing about me had ever been invisible. When I arrived at the convention center in New York, The impact hit immediately. The place was packed. Photographers, journalists, design students, collectors with notebooks in hand. The air smelled of fresh varnish, mingling with expensive perfume. They led me to my exhibition space. Under the bright spotlight stood my creations: oak tables, walnut chairs, a cabinet built entirely with flawless joints, not a single nail. But at the center, holding the place of honor, was the table I had made years ago for Jessica, the one she had abandoned in storage. Seeing that table under the lights brought a lump to my throat. It wasn't just furniture. It was the memory of the girl who had once smiled when I gave it to her, before leaving it forgotten. And now, that very piece would be the key to my turning point. Reporters crowded closer, microphones raised. "Mr. Reed, what does this table mean to you?" asked a red-haired journalist, her camera trained on me. I drew a deep breath, felt the weight of the eyes on me. My heart hammered, ready to break free from my chest. I looked at the table, ran my hand gently across the smooth surface, remembering every moment of building it. Then I lifted my eyes to the cameras and said, "Being invisible is easy. What's hard is failing to see the person who's been right in front of you all along." The words left my mouth sharp and firm, like a hammer striking wood. The hall fell silent for a beat. Then came the flurry of camera shutters, a storm of flashes lighting up my face. What followed was like a wave. Crowds lined up to see, to touch, to photograph my work. Collectors made offers on the spot. Renowned architects called my eye craft, living art. And before I could catch my breath, that table, Jessica's forgotten table, was on the front page of the Chicago Tribune. The headline, "From Obscurity to the Spotlight, the craftsman who built dignity into every detail." My name in bold print, my story told, my work recognized. That night, back at the hotel, I turned on my phone. Dozens of missed calls, messages, all from Jessica. Brian had tried calling too. I didn't answer a single one. I just sat there, watching the screen light up, and smiled. Because in that moment, I finally understood something simple. I never had to beg. I never had to shout. I never had to plead for respect. All I had to do was stay true to who I was, and the world at last had seen me. I'll never forget the silence that fell in that dining room the night before when I said, "Tomorrow, you'll see who's really invisible." Now, tomorrow had arrived, and in that instant I realized I was no longer a man trying to prove his worth to his own daughter. I was living proof that no silence lasts forever. My invisibility was over, and my words, printed in newspapers and echoed by thousands online, had become the answer I had been waiting my entire life to give. The day after the article ran was chaos. I woke up early, not from anguish, but from the constant vibration of my phone. Notifications flooded the screen. Messages from strangers, emails from journalists, invitations to interviews. My name, my face, my work were everywhere. In newspapers, on websites, even on TV shows. The Tribune's headline had spread to dozens of outlets. From obscurity to the spotlight, the craftsman who built dignity into every detail. For the first time in decades, I was not invisible. I was news. And amid the avalanche of calls, there was a pattern. Nearly half the missed calls came from one number, Jessica's. Her texts were short, rushed, edged with panic. "Dad, we need to talk. You shouldn't have done this without telling me. Please." Answer, "This is important for the family." I read them all, slowly, and for the first time, I felt no urgency to reply. The silence that had once been my enemy was now my strength. I let her wait. Hours later, I got a call from Brian. I answered, curious to hear his voice without the polish of those luxury dinners. "Thomas, we need to align the narrative," he said bluntly. "No pleasantries. The paper is making it sound like everything you achieved was on your own, but everyone knows our family also played a role in this." I stayed quiet for a few seconds. Then I replied, "Our family? Which part of it? The one that laughed when they said I was invisible? Or the one that let my table rot in storage?" On the other end, silence. Brian cleared his throat, his voice tighter now. "That's not how it looks, but Jessica's image could be damaged. We need to show unity." I smiled, not from joy, but from irony. "You only remember me when my name is worth something. Yesterday I was, invisible. Today, suddenly, I'm essential." He tried to argue, but I hung up. There was nothing left to say. Jessica, however, didn't give up. That same night, she showed up at my workshop. She looked worn down, without the flawless makeup, in a plain dress that clashed with the image of the woman who once ruled over banquet halls. She walked in slowly, glancing around as if seeing the place for the very first time. The smell of wood and varnish seemed foreign to her. "Dad," her voice was low, almost a whisper. I I didn't know this would happen. I looked up from the piece I was sanding. Didn't know what, Jessica? That I existed? Or that even invisible, I still had something to give. She drew a deep breath, eyes brimming with tears. I was wrong. I should have valued you more. I should have told your story. For a moment I almost felt pity. Almost. But then I remembered every laugh, every look of disdain, every gift she had rejected in front of my granddaughter. Jessica, I didn't need you to tell my story. I just needed you to see me, and you chose not to. She stood in silence. Tears rolled down her face, but no words came. She turned and left without saying another thing. The days that followed only made the contrast sharper. While my name appeared in headlines, and I received invitations for lectures, exhibitions, and partnerships, Jessica began to face uneasy stares at the events she organized. Some guests whispered behind her back. Others asked outright, "So, Mr. Reed really is your father? Why did you never mention him before?" Social media was relentless. Photos of me at the convention, standing beside the table under spotlights, went viral. And among the comments, one question kept repeating. How could someone with a father like that ever have called him invisible? It was as if the world itself had become the courtroom she had always used against me. But now, she was the one on trial. I hadn't sought revenge, but truth has its own way of finding space, and by then, it was impossible to hide it. My invisibility had turned into undeniable proof, and the natural consequence was watching my daughter face the weight of what she had done. She had wanted the spotlight to herself, but now, the shadow was hers. That night, alone in the workshop, I looked down at my calloused hands, still dusted with wood shavings, and I realized there was nothing more powerful than time. Time that had silenced me, time that had humiliated me, and time that, in the end, handed me the justice I deserved. I hadn't needed to raise my voice. I hadn't needed to take revenge. All I had to do was keep being who I was, and the world by itself did the rest. Life has a strange way of returning what's been taken from you. For so long, I felt erased, reduced to a background detail at my daughter's parties, a forgotten name in family conversations. But after everything that happened, I realized invisibility is only a fragile label, one that shatters the instant truth, finds room to breathe. After the convention in New York, my world changed. My workshop, once silent and forgotten, became a destination. People came from distant neighborhoods, even from other states, just to see the pieces shaped by my hands. Journalists asked for interviews. Photographers wanted to capture not just the furniture, but also the face behind it. The face no one had wanted to see for years. A local museum reached out. They wanted to display the table I had built for Jessica when she turned 18. The same table she left to rot in a storage unit now stood under spotlights, with a plaque beside it. The Root Table, crafted by Thomas Reed, made from the tree that once grew in the backyard where his daughter grew up. On the day of the unveiling, I stood before the piece for a long time. There was no audience, only me and the hum of the fluorescent lights. I ran my hand across its smooth surface and closed my eyes. It felt like the table itself was a witness to everything. My love as a father, the rejection, the humiliation, and finally, the redemption. It stood there, strong, beautiful, intact, and so did I. Across the city, Jessica faced the weight of her choices. The invitations to her events began to dwindle. Many clients, after hearing my story, questioned why she had never spoken about me, why she had treated me like a ghost. She tried to explain in short interviews, but every justification only made it worse. Her image, once flawless, now had cracks. One day, I received a simple message. "Dad, I just wanted to say I'm sorry." I stared at those words on the screen for a long time, and I realized that, sincere or not, they had come too late. Because apologies can't erase years of silence. Apologies can't return the hugs that were refused. Apologies can't erase the confused look in my granddaughter's eyes when she saw her grandfather erased in front of everyone. I replied calmly without anger, "Jessica, I don't need your apology. I just hope that one day you understand that when you call someone invisible, you're really just revealing your own blindness." She never responded. But life went on. My woodworking shop thrived like never before. I received commissions from universities, churches, even a 5-star hotel that wanted exclusive furniture. For the first time, I had to hire apprentices to keep up with demand. And each young person who came to work with me found not just a job, but also a lesson. Dignity doesn't come from luxury, it comes from truth. Maria, my granddaughter, began visiting me again. Maybe because she insisted on it. Maybe because Jessica no longer had the strength to forbid it. She ran through the shop as before, eyes glowing at the sparks from the saw, the scent of fresh-cut wood filling the air. One day she hugged me tightly and said, "Grandpa, when I grow up, I want to learn to make things like this too. I held back tears. In that moment, I knew, despite everything, my legacy had not been destroyed. Today, when I walk the streets of Chicago, people recognize me. They greet me, ask for photos, tell me how my story gave them strength. And that moves me more than any headline, because I see that my struggle is no longer just mine. Every person who reads my story, who shares it or comments on it, carries within them a piece of the message I fought to preserve. No one deserves to be treated as invisible. It doesn't matter if it's a father, a mother, a grandfather, a grandmother, a simple worker, or a quiet friend. Every human being has value, and the greatest mistake of all is believing you can erase the very person who helped build your path. Sometimes, sitting on the porch of my house, looking up at the Chicago sky dotted with stars, I think about everything that happened. I remember the silence at those dinners, the weight of the humiliations, the pain of being erased by my own flesh and blood, and I realize it was that very silence that gave me strength. The invisibility they tried to force on me became fuel. The shadow that covered me became my stage, and the pain that once crushed me became wood, hard, resilient, capable of being shaped into beauty. Today, I hold no hatred, no bitterness. I hold only one certainty. Time reveals, and time has proven that I was never truly invisible. And that is what I leave with you, listening to me now. Never accept less than your dignity. Never let the arrogance of those who've forgotten their roots define your worth. If you must, stay silent at first, but only to gather strength. And when the time comes, show who you are. Not with words, but with actions no one can deny. Now I want to hear from you. Has anyone ever called you invisible? Have you ever been made to feel like nothing you did mattered? Share your story in the comments, because your story matters. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because every time you comment, every time you take part, we prove together that respect is never begged for. Respect is earned.